Well, good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the OECD. I'm Jo Tyndall. I'm the Director of the Environment Directorate here at the OECD, and it is my very great pleasure to open this event, the launch of the International System Change Compass, ISCC, report in France, where we're delighted to see you all here in the room in person and with many more joining us online. As a brief introduction for those of you not familiar with our work, the Organization for Cooperation and for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, has 38 member countries, plus the European Union. As an international organization, we work with governments, policymakers, and citizens to establish evidence-based international standards and find solutions to a range of social, economic, and environmental challenges. All of this is in pursuit of our overarching goal to build better policies for better lives. We've been working on climate change and environmental issues for decades. In fact, our Environment Policy Committee recently celebrated its 50th birthday, having been established in 1971. And one of its first big breakthroughs was the invention and adoption of the now well-known and well-established polluter pays principle. That happened in 1972. But if we fast forward to 2023, it's the existential threat of climate change that is our top priority. In addressing it, the breadth of the OECD's expertise and policy reach is particularly valuable as we face the challenge of triggering a genuinely economy-wide transition towards net zero emissions. I'm really pleased today to welcome the three authors of the IPCCC report. First, Sandrine Dixson-Declève, who's the co-president of the Club of Rome and a member, we are delighted, of the OECD's high-level advisory panel for our cross-cutting Net Zero Plus project. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. Second, Janez Potocnik, whose partner is Systemiq, and a former EU commissioner for the environment. And third, Heather Grabbe, who is the senior advisor of the Open Society Foundation. Now, I think I speak for many here this morning when I say you have written an excellent, timely, and much needed report. I look forward very much to hearing presentations about it very shortly. Now, we've got a panel for discussion after the presentations as well. And I'd like to welcome our esteemed panelists. First, Francois Gemenne, who's a lead author for the IPCC and director of the Hugo Observatory at the University of Liège. Second, Philippe Varin, Vice President, International Chamber of Commerce and former chair of France Industry and Suez. That's how it's written down here. I don't know if that's correct, Philippe. Here and third, Sebastien Treyer, Executive Director of IDDRI, the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations, based here in Paris. Now, with a wealth of experience and expertise amongst you, I've no doubt you will give us valuable insights into today's themes. And frankly, I can't wait to dive into the discussion with you shortly. Lastly, I want to introduce and welcome our moderator, business journalist Charlotte Kahn. Thank you so much for being here. As you're aware, the purpose of today's discussion is to explore what would need to be done to implement the European Green Deal at a global level, how international governance could be reframed to enable a global transition to sustainability, and what are the transformative changes to systems that this implies. I have to say these themes mesh very well with several work streams underway in the OECD Environment Directorate, and I will talk about these a little bit later. This event is also very timely given the release last week of the synthesis report pulling together the analysis and conclusions of the IPCC's sixth assessment report. The report highlights once again what we all know, that we aren't yet doing enough to limit the global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. At the same time, the report points to multiple feasible and viable policies available to reduce emissions and build more climate resilient societies. So governments can take action and need to do so urgently to tackle the climate crisis. The move from ambition to action is going to be easier, though, if we collaborate. It's not just a case of setting an ambitious target to be achieved at a point in the comfortably distant future. It is a case of moving from ambition to action right now, and really we should see it as a shared challenge. The IPCC synthesis report therefore also underlines the role of global governance frameworks and international cooperation as essential enablers of climate action, which is a key point of today's discussion. I'm sure we're all eager to hear more about the report by now, so I'll just close. And in doing so, I want to thank you all once more for being here at what I'm sure will be an insightful and interesting event. And with that, I'm going to pass over to Sandrine Dixson-Declève.
Thank you so much, Jo, and thank you very much to you and the OECD team for inviting us here today. Myself and my colleagues are incredibly appreciative to all of you and to be able to hold this meeting here in this esteemed institution. Also because of the incredible work that you are doing and the rest of the OECD in unpacking what we think are some of the deepest challenges facing us today. The importance of this report, and before I go into too much detail, I would like to show a very short introduction, which I hope will actually demonstrate why we have produced this report together and why we believe that as we move through Europe's key objectives around the European Green Deal, we address actually the complexities of applying the European Green Deal within Europe and the relationship that we must continue in a positive way, the partnership with the rest of the world. And what does that actually look like? So if I may ask those that will be actually showing the short film to go ahead and do so now. Wonderful. So that was a very short introduction to the report, which I hope you will all read or have already been able to read. The reason why myself, as the co-president of the Club of Rome, is so taken by this report and also believes fundamentally that the messaging in this report is so important is because as we address new governance, both in terms of the institutional frameworks that we need, but also the types of relationships that we develop here as we face the complexities of the 21st century challenges. I bring with me the history of 50 years of the limits to growth. And with that, the knowledge that we have focused far too much on supply side economics rather than on demand side management. the fact that actually we must address consumption patterns, and that this systems change compass both looks at the need to address consumption, the way in which we relate with resource use, but also the types of decision-making processes that we need to put in place, which are systemic and which are optimized. We know now, coming out of what I call the 3 Cs, COVID, climate, and conflict, and unfortunately, we still have conflict on our doorstep, that we are as vulnerable as the most vulnerable link, that our value chains are completely interrelated, that if we have unholy alliances or dependencies, that will actually backfire in terms of the way in which we engage with the value chain, in terms of the way in which we take certain access relationships for granted, such as access to food and access to energy. So it is clear that here today, here in Paris, knowing full well some of the backlash that we've had on certain policies, but across Europe in terms of energy poverty, in terms of the way in which we are now dealing with desertification. In fact, in France, because there is going to be a huge issue with the lack of water coming from actually the snowmelt, which we have not had this year, that we must start to address these issues head on, but not only within a European context, that we look at net zero as a way to anchor zero carbon, zero poverty, and zero biodiversity loss. And that actually takes systemic approaches. That our current policy approach is not integrated. We've seen that many of our ministries continue to focus on siloed approaches, and we've seen that through the recovery plans. And we see it across not only the European institutions, but also the way in which member states continue their policies. So a green and social recovery is one which must fundamentally be based on a new value set, a new set of principles which we define within the compass. And that compass is hopefully a way in which we can steer a more optimized and more relevant type of policy making for the 21st century challenges that we have. That means a holistic approach, as you can see here with these 10 principles, taking into consideration that we need to look as much at a shift in governance as we do at a shift in prosperity and the way in which we address prosperity. At the European level, in May, we will have the largest cross-party conference on beyond growth, addressing new indicators to growth. What does that mean, not only within a European context, but the way in which we plan and we partner at the international level? The compass should serve as a stress testing tool to ensure that actually we can move forward in a collaborative way that doesn't remix or reshape the neo-colonial patterns that we have, but actually completely changes that paradigm of neo-colonialism into relationships which are mutually beneficial. This is our belief that actually only a holistic approach, similar to this international system change compass approach, is the way in which we can move through not only the European Green Deal, but also the way in which we address our partners. We have seen through the shift and the stresses that we have now in terms of energy, that our relationship in particular with Africa is actually continuing a pattern of dependency, but also continuing to push African producers towards fossil energy rather than the reverse. That hypocrisy cannot continue. From a Club of Rome perspective, and also from the collaborative here today, this international system change compass should give us the guidance to actually move in a much more beneficial way, where we can look at mutuality in servicing both social and green as the way in which we move forward. So let me finish with the following. We cannot fail. We must actually, and our greatest challenge is to see how we can redefine the way in which we engage through prosperity as an enhancement of people's lives and livelihoods as they're faced with not only the 3 C's, but potential shocks and stresses of the future. That we redefine in particular our relationship with consumption, which means that actually in the West, we will have to reduce consumption patterns and ensure that we work with our southern neighbors to really enhance economic development and address prosperity together. And that we look at the underbelly of that relationship, which is both the way in which capital flows enable this shift, but also that economic indicators give us the direction that we need that goes beyond just GDP and a growth and productivity indicator, but takes into consideration a broader spectrum of indicators. So I would like to now hand over to my colleagues, and I think I'm starting with Janez first, even though in the agenda it says the reverse, to address in particular the resource element of our discussions and what you see in the system change compass and why it's so absolutely imperative that we get this right. Janez.
Thanks, Sandrine. Maybe one thing before I start. I'm actually wearing many hats today. As you can see, I'm with a Systemiq hat. But majority of the things which I will be sharing, and Jo did not mention that, is based on the role which I have by co-chairing International Resource Panel. This is UNEP-based sister organization of IPCC and IPBES, and we are science policy interface in the area of resource management, natural resource management. So we are kind of scientific backbone of resource management. So one probably most important result of our biggest report, which we have till now published in 2019, Global Resource Outlook, is that the way we manage our natural resources, it's actually behind all the environmental challenges. It's actually a driver of our challenges which we are facing. So 90% of land-related biodiversity loss, 90% of water stress, 50% of climate change, and more than 1/3 of the pollution, it's related to extraction and processing of natural resources. So we have to look what is happening there if we want to manage the challenges which we have. The first thing, what we have found also is that the trends are far from good. So resource use has tripled till in last 50 years, and it is expected to double by 2060 if we don't fundamentally change the trends. So what is also quite important due to our research is that resource use harbors deep inequalities. It's actually high-income countries who are profiting from resource use and exploitation most, while the effects of that exploitation are landing in low-income countries. World Inequality Lab recently published the 2023 Climate Inequality Report, showing how much of that inequality is driving the climate change. And they found that the top 10% of global emitters are responsible for 50% of global carbon emissions. This is not just a country-level study. It's actually the highest consumers everywhere responsibility. So while we look to the relations between the high and low-income countries, we should certainly look also inside the countries between those who are consuming more and those who are consuming less. Central question we should ask, and we are not asking it many times, it's actually this one: how to provide human needs in more energy and resource efficient way? That's the central question. Not how to provide more clean energy, but how to provide human needs and use as few energy as possible for providing human needs. So what is driving us in the International Resource Panel? It's so-called theory of decoupling. So we have to decouple the growth of well-being and economic growth from the growth of resource use and environmental impacts. And if I, for a moment, now turn to the European Union story, if you look to the European Green Deal, which is without any doubt a very visionary document, you would find there the sentence which is most quoted: of reaching no net emissions of greenhouse gases in 2050, and where economic growth is decoupled from resource use. This is the quotation. But frankly, we speak about no net emissions 2050 a lot, about decoupling. Not really. It's more difficult. And of course, it's very much connected to the system changes which Sandrine was talking about. They are somehow set aside and rarely mentioned. And we have to be aware that European Union is not only fragile when it comes to the import of energy. We have learned that pretty quickly. But we are fragile when it comes to the import of different kinds of materials too. Only that regional dependency, it's not exactly on the same region like it was in the case of energy. So it makes all the sense that while we are asking the question how to actually sustain the provision of energy and materials, that we also ask how we can save the energy and materials. So we should simply be careful that we don't switch from an energy system which is based on fossil fuels to the energy system which is more or less based on more materials, because it's one dependency which is replaced with another. By the way, you have probably seen that Commission has recently adopted so-called Critical Raw Materials Act. I'm not the happiest person with that proposal. It's very much focusing on how we would sustain the inflow and our security, but it's not really so partially it is of course addressing the question of how to actually be more resilient. But resilience, it's best achieved if you actually first look inside your countries where you can again use less of some things and make yourself less dependent. It is talking about recycling also, but recycling, it's, as we probably know in circular economy, the worst of the good. And I would summarize it in focusing only on waste. It's unfortunately a wasted opportunity. Coming to circular economy should be understood as an instrument for delivering the decoupling I was talking about. And it's definitely a kind of core ingredient in strengthening resilience and strategic autonomy. Which brings me to the conclusions which are following the report which we have done jointly, International System Change Compass, where we have identified basically 3 main blind spots which are missing from policy attention, but also wider. The first is lack of holistic system change approach. When, for example, in the climate change, they look to the problems they have to settle, they look to how to limit the CO2 emissions. If I would be a bit trying to tell you in a way that it's understandable to everybody, we have to come with CO2 emissions to zero, whatever it will cost. And what we are asking is what it will cost and how can we actually limit that cost, because there are also other questions which we have to handle in the meantime, not only the climate change. And water, it was already mentioned, it's a typical one, not to mention biodiversity loss, pollution, and so on. So it's very important that whatever question we address it through trying to see what are the implications of solutions which we propose, not only on one area, but on practically across the field. Second, we have noticed that there is a lack of going to the roots of the problem, or if you want, to the drivers and pressures. which in our case, it's going back to the upstream, to the resource use, and also to the signals which we are sending to the markets. If we don't go as far and address those, then the drivers would simply be wrong. So you can ask consumer as many times as you wish to change our behavior, but as long as everybody of us will have to pay more for the food which is more environmentally friendly produced, you are just asking us to behave against everything what we are taught in economic faculty. So be stupid. That's what actually we are required, and it will not work, believe me, because some cannot afford it and the others simply are not stupid. So we need to change economic signals which we are sending, and we need to go back to the drivers and pressures in that story. So and the third one, and we have to understand there, and this is also one of the conclusions, that social transition, fairness, equity, which Sandrine already mentioned, goes hand in hand with the environmental transition. We will not succeed with environmental transition not addressing those questions. Something which is not acceptable, it's not acceptable, full stop. You don't need to do any theory behind that. And the third is the lack of the demand side focus. So all our efforts are pretty much supply side focus, so cleaning the supply side. But if you clean the steel industry, as important as that is, and don't ask the question how much of that steel is actually used in empty cars and empty houses, then you simply don't deliver the whole part of the answer. And I think if you want to address the questions which are linked to the equality, to fairness, you can't do it without asking and opening the demand side, which means asking the question, who is surpassing planetary boundaries? Who is living out of the safe operating space? Whose production and consumption is actually more wasteful? So these are the core questions which needs simply to be addressed to. So we have prioritized the prevailing broken economic system for so long that it sometimes proves impossible for decision makers to imagine a different one. And any suggestion to deviate from the resource extraction driven economic growth, it's immediately somehow parallelly met with accusation that you are against the people's well-being and so on, which is not true. It's just the opposite. To conclude, trying to maintain the current economic system and at the same time fixing the chronic triple planetary crisis, it's simply not consistent. It will not work. So we need a system change. And there are some basic conditions, basic shifts which would be needed. First, we must shift away from the prevailing economic logic, which puts humans in function to economic growth, simply defined by GDP, towards an economy that it's efficiently meeting human needs. The current logic is both ethically and ecologically unsustainable, and we need to set the order right. Second, we need to move from an economy considering humans as external and superior to nature to an economy acknowledging that we are embedded with nature. Destroying nature, it's destroying ourselves because we are nature. Third, we need to move from an extraction-based production to a circular creation-based production. So stop stimulating extraction-based economic success and rather reward responsible, innovative, creative ways of meeting human needs. And finally, we must fix our governance structures and make them fit for purpose. This is the paradigm shift in leadership and governance that's needed. Realization that states' long-term sovereignty can only be protected through genuine, deep cooperation right now with the institutional reforms to match. But these broad recommendations has been made for many years without being sufficiently considered. So in the report, we have developed specific recommendations designed, and Heather will talk more about those solutions. So without a real system change, circular economy being an important part of it, we will simply miss not only the climate and biodiversity targets, but more. And why more? Because access and use of natural resources have been in human history always the base for the level of well-being of nations, but unfortunately also the base for conflicts, for wars, and the transitional story we talk about, the transitional story about reconciliation between humans and nature. It's actually the story not only of environmental transition, it's the story of future economics, peace, stability, and this is actually the decision we have to do. If we do it wrongly, we will see more of what we are currently already seeing. So we must simply deepen and broaden cooperation around this and put the European Green Deal efforts into broader efforts linked also to the peace and stability. Or we will fail to deliver a vision and response which Europe will need to deliver in next years when the next Commission will be in place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janez. You've heard a lot about the report now, and we want to make the most of the time with our expert panelists in responding to it. So I'm going to just give you a few points about what this means for the EU's relationships globally. What does the European Green Deal mean for the rest of the world? If it's fully achieved, both the emissions targets and also the resource use, which, as Janez pointed out, is there in the original founding document, this will have profound implications for the rest of the world, because Europe will, if it achieves the goal of Fit for 55, reduce the emissions produced on the European continent to below 5% of global emissions, which sounds great. It's a fantastic story that EU commissioners and foreign ministers can tell to the world, we've reduced our emissions by more than half, we're just a tiny percentage of the total. But of course, this achievement, important as it is, does not account for the European responsibility for the much larger proportion of emissions, but also biodiversity loss, pollution, water stress, and other environmental impacts caused by European consumption. It only looks at the supply side. It only considers European production on our own continent. And it's actually vital to think about the way that Europe as a consumer drives environmental degradation elsewhere in the world, because Europe cannot be a green island in a dirtier world. This isn't going to make, this isn't really going to help, because it doesn't matter where the emissions come from in terms of the impact on the climate. And of course, pollution and biodiversity loss have enormous cross-border implications. So really, the European Green Deal needs to drive a global transition to climate neutrality, and a global transition which delivers fairer outcomes both within societies and also between global north and global south, to put it very succinctly. So how do we start to think about incorporating the embedded water, the embedded pollution, the embedded emissions in Europe's economic relationships? It means focusing on the demand side, as Janez has been pointing out, and also rewarding better production globally. It's a different approach to trade policy, which isn't just focused on increasing the volume of trade and having trade deals, which ensure the continued resourcing of the European economy with raw materials from elsewhere in the world. It's about enabling, through trade policy, a global transition that moves other countries up the value chain. So not just taking their lithium and making batteries in Europe, but actually encouraging clean tech batteries made with the highest production standards also in, for example, Chile, also, for example, in Africa. It also means a rather radically different approach to development policy, which thinks about countries' own chosen transition paths. What do they want to do in terms of reaching climate neutrality for their country and supporting that? not supporting necessarily short-term priorities or indeed what is good for the European economy, but what works for a global transition. And it means changing quite radically agricultural policy in Europe and its associated respects. But it also means thinking about redefining some of these elements you saw in the system change compass in the video at the very start of this session. Redefining competitiveness. Competitiveness is not just producing at the cheapest price. It's also about meeting human needs. Can we start up a global competition for who can meet human needs with the lowest input of resources and the most innovation, as Janez was pointing out? How do we redefine metrics so that we accurately measure the real value being created in our economies and value nature, natural capital in particular? In our current economic metrics, they overvalue capital in terms of productive capital, they undervalue human capital, and they don't value natural capital at all. It's simply not there in the statistics. Now, the OECD has, of course, as Jo was referring to earlier, started really pioneering work on this a decade ago in thinking beyond GDP. Now this is moving into beyond growth, as Sandrine was pointing out. There's a movement which is changing, but we need to see the official metrics change very quickly. And the European Union is a key way of doing that, working with the OECD on pricing carbon, but also now needs to think about how to price biodiversity, how to price pollution into all of the metrics that we have for our economic system. And of course, it means redefining the EU's relationships with international partners according to the needs of the global transition and in order to reduce the imbalances between high-income countries and low-income countries. So just to conclude, this is really about making the climate transition globally win-win, not competition between continents for who grabs the green market the fastest. Yes, that we need to stimulate innovation, we need to stimulate the take-up of clean technology across production chains, but also building an economy of the future that is fundamentally more resource efficient, fundamentally better at valuing natural capital, maintaining ecosystem services, maintaining what we have left in terms of the planetary systems which enable us to survive. That's the competition that we need to be aiming for if we're thinking about redefining competitiveness rather than country by country or even continent by continent. And in the report, you'll see we have a number of ideas that we put out for that, also on governance, which I won't go into now. But I would just like to now hand over to Charlotte Kahn, who's going to moderate the panel with this thought that the European Green Deal, it's a noble effort. It's fantastic that the EU has put it forward, but now it needs to work for everybody on the planet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heather, but I would like to hear from Jo first, who is going to present her thoughts on what we've heard so far.
Well, thank you very much. And I've taken extensive notes of some really interesting points that have already been made. But I'm afraid you're going to have to listen to me again. I now have the opportunity to speak a little bit further about the kinds of thinking that Heather, for example, has alluded to that the OECD is doing. But first, I want to say a huge thank you to the three authors for their illuminating and really succinct presentation of the International System Change Compass. It's great to see it identified as a compass, really makes it clear. And it is clear the implications for global governance of the European Green Deal are extensive and important, both in terms of international relations and for achieving environmental objectives. We here at the OECD are really pleased to see such incisive work on this subject. So I want to begin by saying huge congratulations for the preparation and publication of this excellent report. Now, several of the IPCC's report's key findings on the importance of systems thinking, of exploiting the linkages between different environmental crises, and of adopting a resilience lens to policy making, they really resonate strongly with us. These are themes that we are emphasizing in various strands of our work in the OECD's Environment Directorate. One key example of this, I thought it would be useful to touch on today, is the OECD's cross-cutting flagship initiative, Net Zero Plus, Climate and Economic Resilience in a Changing World, which hopefully will come up. And if it doesn't, I'm going to call for technical assistance, please. Thank you. So the IPCCC report really highlights effectively how fragmentation and siloed approaches in the global governance landscape lead to policy incoherence. And this is precisely one of the central issues this project, Net Zero Plus, addresses. It's a truly whole of organization effort, drawing on work across the OECD's many policy communities. We've got 12 different directorates within the OECD directly contributing to Net Zero Plus. It's a project that provides advice to governments for breaking down these silos. And it makes a compelling case, which is matched by the major step we've taken in mainstreaming climate change across the work of the OECD. But the Net Zero Plus project is much more than mainstreaming. At its core, the project is about supporting policymakers to implement transformative policies while navigating the ever-changing circumstances and global disruptions such as those we've faced in recent years. It's felt, I think, a little bit like standing in waist-deep water with wave after wave, ever getting bigger, coming in to sweep us off our feet. And we can't afford to be taken off course. So like the IPCCC report, Net Zero Plus recognizes that resilience is essential for our efforts to tackle the climate crisis. And it applies a resilience lens in its analysis across policy areas. The first phase of Net Zero Plus has been pulled together in a major synthesis report. This is now being finalized and is expected to be launched in May. I think I can sum up the report's central messages quite succinctly, and they're a little bit reflected on the screen there. First, we know that climate change has the potential to trigger multiple crises, a threat that is only increasing as we risk crossing irreversible tipping points. Linear and incremental actions simply won't be enough, in particular considering the clear challenges posed by COVID-19, supply chain disruptions, cost of living increases, and of course, Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. Net Zero Plus compellingly argues for an alternative, mainstreaming climate policy by applying systems thinking and strategic foresight to build resilience. And by resilience, we mean resilience both to the transition to net zero itself and resilience to the increasingly obvious climate impacts. This means getting pricing signals right, encouraging good behavior and discouraging bad behavior. And I think that's reflected in the IPCCC report, ensuring a fair and equitable transition and looking at how we can transform investments, especially in the much needed area of innovation, as well as shifting the whole focus of the global financial system. It also means overcoming the compartmentalization of climate into mitigation versus adaptation by harnessing synergies, including with other environmental challenges like biodiversity. And that's already been touched on this morning. So if we had to boil it down to just a few words, it would be those you can see on the slide: urgency, resilience, systems thinking, and mainstreaming. And of course, this resonates strongly with the key messages of the ISCC report. Like the ISCC, a key output of Net Zero Plus is a set of targeted, practical policy recommendations. And these highlight the synergies across different areas of policy making and show how they can be leveraged for climate objectives. Several work streams in the Environment Directorate are applying systems thinking in their approach. I'm going to try again with clicking. No, over to you. Thank you, guys. So first, to ensure that policies go beyond the symptoms, that is what we can see as the tip of the iceberg of the climate crisis, and are able to address the root causes that will in turn lead to better functioning systems. And one example of the OECD's systems thinking work reflected in Net Zero Plus was a study we did last year, a case study on redesigning Ireland's transport for net zero. It was one of the very first things I did after I arrived here in my new role, and it was very well received by the Irish government. Now, this report identifies transformative policies for reducing transport emissions in Ireland. One small sector, one small country, long way to go, but it's a start. We worked with numerous stakeholders to identify the root causes of car dependency and practical, achievable ways forward for transitioning towards sustainable transport systems. This work led to a revised National Climate Action Plan in Ireland. While the previous focus had been mainly on improving the type of vehicles, i.e. moving towards EVs, for example, this new plan goes further with a focus on systems transformation in the whole transport sector, including public transport and active mobility, how to make behavior change easy and attractive. Elsewhere, the ISCC report highlights how levels of resource consumption in Europe and in many other high-income countries are unsustainable. That's becoming increasingly apparent. It argues that a system change to successfully implement the European Green Deal is going to require us to redefine our natural resource use. This understanding that we're in a truly resource-constrained world is gaining currency. It's long overdue. And given the strong emphasis on consumption patterns and materials extraction, let me highlight another relevant piece of OECD work, the Global Material Resources Outlook to 2060. And that's reflected in this slide. The Materials Outlook puts forward projections of materials use and their consequences, providing a quantitative outlook to 2060 at the global, sectoral, and regional levels for 61 different materials. It explains the economic drivers, determining the decoupling of economic growth and materials use. And let me just focus here on just one dimension. If you delve into it, the analysis also highlights the wide range of environmental impacts arising from our use of materials and how these impacts vary dramatically for different materials. So what we've got here is the first example, concrete. While its biggest impact is clearly on climate change, the green slice of pie there, if we click through to iron, this also has implications for human toxicity and acidification, the blue and the grey slices of pie. Whereas the third example, copper, its impacts are more oriented to water and air pollution. Well, it looks like we've covered most of the bases around that circle just from these three materials. And all of this reinforces the need for greater coherence, not just between resource management and climate change, but also with a range of other policies like trade and innovation. So just with a few closing reflections on the report, I want to offer a couple of personal reflections on it. I was particularly struck by the findings on the pressing need to fill global governance gaps for the transition. Public support, the social license to act, is critical. So my first point is that inclusiveness and well-being is going to be at the heart of efforts to bring about a fair and equitable transition. The IPCC calls for a paradigm shift from a simple focus on GDP to welfare metrics across international institutions. This shift towards designing and implementing policy through the prism of long-term human development is very much supported by OECD work, in particular our beyond GDP and well-being approaches. And just as one example, the well-being approach was very much incorporated into the report I mentioned before on redesigning Ireland's transport for net zero. We see these approaches as an effort to reset values to something more aligned with vitally needed systems change. The second, it is certainly true that we have challenges to overcome in the international sphere, but we would do well to remember that global governments and institutional frameworks are only as good as the governments that design and agree them. This means that better governance still begins at home, in capitals. So national governments should prioritize approaches that support legitimacy, transparency, and our word of the day, coherence. So I look forward to further discussing these themes with this excellent panel of speakers. Thank you very much. And I think I now hand back to Charlotte.
Thank you very much, Jo, for your thoughts and recommendations. I think the IPCC message is crystal clear. When implementing its Green Deal, Europe should not and cannot think in isolation, act or see itself as a remote, secluded, green island. We are fragile, to quote Janez. We are dependent for our food, energy, and resource security on the rest of the world. Resilience is not a synonym for self-reliance or self-governance, or even competition, to quote Heather. So this is how we're going to structure our discussion today. First of all, I'll ask our panel participants to each present their thoughts, their reflections of what we've heard so far this morning, whilst being very mindful that we are already running out of time, of course, and are supposed to wrap up this discussion in 1 hour's time. And then I invite the authors of the IPCC report to join in for a fruitful and productive discussion. At the end of the session, I will leave enough time for you, the audience, to ask your questions to our experts today. So let's get started. And I'd like to start with you, Francois Gemenne, since there's not a day these days where you're not in the news since the publication of the IPCC report, which UN Chief Antonio Guterres referred to as a survival guide for humanity. Very strong words here. And he also recommended, and I'm quoting him here, an everything, everywhere, all at once approach to climate action. So I guess, Francois, you can only agree with what we've heard so far this morning. We need a systemic approach.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me as part of this panel. And yes, it is a pleasure to comment on this report. First of all, I'd like to really congratulate the authors for putting together the compass, which I see really as a kind of reply to the seminal work on the planetary boundaries. In a way, the planetary boundaries was the diagnosis upon which we all agree, and it was left with a hanging question, what to do now? And I really see this compass as a way to move the discussion forward and also to respond to these planetary boundaries. In my comments, which I'll try to keep as brief as possible, I would like to address 2 points, one drawing on geology and the other drawing on climate physics. Let me start with the first one on geology. Most geologists now reckon that we have entered a new geological period, which they call the Anthropocene, literally the age of humans. And I feel that the Anthropocene as a new geological epoch is also in dire need of a new political, economic, and social compass. Because achieving net zero when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions, it's not just a matter of replacing fossil fuels with low carbon energies. We need, I believe, to recognize that our societies, economies, and eventually democracies are deeply embedded in the Holocene, that is the geological period we have just exited and in which we were left for the last 12,000 years. And therefore, if we are to combat climate change meaningfully, we will need not only to redefine the way we produce and consume goods, but we will also need to redefine the very fundamentals of international order. That is, the very core principles, ideas, and values upon which we have built our societies and democracies so far. What does liberty look like in a net zero world? How do we define responsibility towards people we don't know because they belong to next generations or because they live in countries where we will never go? How do we redefine equality if we consider that we are just one small part of human life and life in general on the planet? And perhaps most importantly, what do we make of sovereignty and of our relationship with territory, when clearly the territory of so many countries is rendered uninhabitable, not because the actions these countries have taken, but because of the actions taken by other countries upon which they have extremely little impact. And that is, of course, the reason why fighting climate change is so difficult, because it is not just a technological challenge, it is also very much a political, and I would even say a philosophical endeavor, and for which we will badly need a compass. My second point draws on the physics of climate change. Of course, as you all know, the climate doesn't care whether the emissions come from Paris, Lima, or Bangkok. Clearly, the future climate of France will not just depend on what the French government will achieve when it comes to its net zero objectives. Same for Europe. However good the Green Deal might be, the future climate of Europe does not depend on the Green Deal, or certainly not only on the Green Deal. And yet the problem is that the more we realize that we are deeply tied to one another, the more we realize that we are part of one single community of destiny, the more we seem to be obsessed with our national sovereignty. All we'll talk about is energy sovereignty, food sovereignty, sovereignty of this, sovereignty of that. We need to recognize that all of this is sort of a fantasy, and that we will all increasingly depend upon each other. And the problem of this focus on sovereignty is that we often remain focused on our own emissions and obsessed with doing our part, and just our part, which we often define as our share of global greenhouse gas emissions. In 1962, the territorial emissions from the EU represented 42% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Now, it represents less than 15%. In 10 years from now, probably less than 10%. So my point here is to say that decarbonizing the European economy will only work if other countries decarbonize their economies as well. As it has been said, there is no point in being a carbon-free island in an ocean of carbon. The problem is, what do we offer to the other countries in their endeavor to decarbonize their own economies? When we organize a climate conference in Dubai, in a country that has built its whole economy on exploitation of fossil fuels, we pretend to be shocked, as if we could just organize climate conference in our nice OECD countries and tell ourselves how good and virtuous we are. When Uganda begins to exploit its own reserves of oil, we also condemn these global south countries for willing to exploit their own fossil fuel reserves. There are lots of mobilization right now in France against the EACOP pipeline that will exploit the oil reserve of Uganda. And yes, this is a climate time bomb. We need to recognize that. But we also need to adopt for a moment the viewpoint of Uganda. At the current price of crude oil, the exploitation of this oil reserve amounts to about 20 times its GDP. And what did we offer Uganda? Our indignation. And that's it. Solar energy is making huge progress everywhere in the world, but on Africa. That is, on the continent that receives the most sunshine on an annual basis, naturally. So what's the end result of this? Well, of course, now African leaders like Senegalese President Macky Sall now describe fossil fuels as tools for their sovereignty vis-à-vis Europe. Well played, EU.
Thank you very much, Francois. I think I will then hand over to Philippe Varin for a valuable perspective from the private sector and the industry.
Yes, thank you, Charlotte. Just to add to my introduction, which was focused on the International Chamber of Commerce, just to tell you that I spent 45 years in industry. So I'm very concerned by the materials matter. 25 years in aluminium, 6 in steel, 6 in the car business, 6 in the nuclear business, and then Suez. And I fully support what Janez has said about the fact that materials is a root cause of CO2 emissions and biodiversity and so on. There's the reason why I set up a forum in Nancy called the World Materials Forum 9 years ago to convene 300 people from the planet to have some collective intelligence work about this question. So perhaps three general comments on the situation, and then one point about some work I did in France on the supply of raw materials for the French governments, some thoughts about the Paris Peace Forum, where I contributed as well, and finally, obviously, on the European Green Deal. On the three messages that I would like to leave to you is, so one is access to resources is going to create political risks. The transition ahead of us is materials hungry. Just to name a few, be aware that the materials footprint of an EV, electrical vehicle, is 6 times higher than the footprint of a thermal engine car. The same is true for a kilowatt hour for a wind farm compared to the kilowatt hour for a gas turbine. So in the next 30 years, we will extract from the planet, if I take the figures of Janez, as much as since the inception of humanity. So indeed, there will be tensions because the demand growth is going to be explosive in the next 10 years on lithium, probably 8 times, 10 times on what it is today in demands, nickel, copper, 2 to 3 times, rare earth, 3 to 4 times. And on the supply side is going to be very constrained because all this needs, we need new mines for primary metals. I think this is going to be an issue because, you know, the big global corporate in mining used to spend $100 billion in new mines. It has been gone to a trough 4 years ago, 50 instead of $100 billion. It's climbing up a little bit, but there is no headroom. And to start a new mine takes, 7 years at least. So we are pretty sure that there will be some problems in the next 10 years. And also something we should add is on the supply side, the populations in the resources-rich country, they know also the problem of NIMBY, not in my backyard. It's not only an issue for the developed countries. We have political situations which are unstable in a number of resource-rich countries, and the norms are also more and more stringent as well. So the tension is going to be there. This is one thing. And we are living a world where CO2 and oil and gas has been driving conflicts, and we should not enter into a new world where materials are going to drive conflict. The second thought is that this question of materials will be sorted out, as we have said, through technological breakthroughs as well as societal changes at the same time, not incremental progress. And collective intelligence is key to sort out these matters. And the world today, we have no, collective intelligence works very well if it's based on facts and figures. We don't have the figures, we don't have the proper KPIs, it has been said, they hardly exist today. And also there is no governance to set up this collective intelligence work. And by the way, circular economy is not going to be the solution in the next 10 years because the batteries, the engines, all this will be in the cars. So we have to start this new value chains with eco-design since the beginning. But at the same time, for the next 10 years or 10, 15 years, we have to extract more primary metals. So this is the second thought. The third one is that EU is very late behind China and now the US. China started 20 years ago to really control the supply chains of raw materials. And if you look at the value chains of batteries, China controls with Belt and Road and all the work of the state-owned enterprise in the mining, also the car business. They control 50% of the value chains on batteries, so nickel, lithium, cobalt. And today, they supply 90% of the magnets of the world for the engines, the car engines, but also for the wind farms. And we have to be very conscious of this. At the same time, the US have reacted recently with the Inflation Reduction Act. And the Inflation Reduction Act, is very clear. Materials have to be extracted from the US, from Canada, or for South America, and also Australia. And that's it. It's autarky. But then the EU will have, because this nature of geology, will have to import 70% of its needs in 2030, 70%. So a big part of these imports should be from Africa. This is probably not exactly the case. And, especially because we have to balance the ESG constraints of the OEMs in Europe with the brands and all which goes with it, with the risk to supply from African countries where obviously today ESG warranties are not there. So now in this context, we can understand why the EU has to have a global vision. Otherwise, the European Green Deal will not work out. Please, if you can enjoy the music. Thank you. So second point, I've been led to make some proposal recently here in this country for the supply of critical raw materials. What I have advised strongly is, one, we need to have a proper governance in this country. And it's about moving a whole ecosystem and a new ecosystem. And you have to appoint somebody at the French government to drive all this process. And at the same time, you have to have an observatory, which is we have set up a private public observatory to anticipate and to update in real time all the figures on the balance between supply and demand. We have to open new mines, and we started to open new mines, but this requires responsible mining standards. And today, it's not clear, even at the EU level, what we mean by responsible mining. We have to agree on what is the real standard that we are targeting. And frankly, that in the EU, we don't have within the taxonomy, the mines of lithium. It's nonsense. We can put nuclear, we can put gas in the taxonomy, but the mines to make all these materials very useful for the battery value chains are not in the taxonomy today. So this has to be done. We have to address the question of transformation, because when we speak about access to resources, we think mines, which is okay, but between the mines and the gigafactory, you have a number of steps. Should they be located in France, in Dunkirk, in some other places, or should they be located close to the mine? So it's an issue that we have to look at very seriously if you want to build strong partnership with resource-rich countries. Otherwise, it will not work out. We have to think about the R&D and skills system, and we have to fund all this transition. I recommended we have a private-public investment fund to take minority shares in the mines. And currently in the Critical Raw Materials Act that has been issued by the EU, there is no mention of this funding matter. And thinking we'll do all this without allocating funds, I think it's a dream. It will not happen. And lastly, we need a materials diplomacy because we have to find proper, when you import 70% of your needs, you better have to choose your friends. So this is for France. At the same time, last 11th of November, took place in this country, the Paris Peace Forum. And some of the panelists here have signed a call to action. What we have in this call to action is 5 things. One is we must strengthen norms and standards, which I already mentioned, across the board for Global North, but also for Global South. 2, we have to foster cooperation between states. And to do this, we need an area, a place where there is a repository of all the key data. So is it the International Resource Panel? Is it a kind of International Energy Agency for Materials? Is it the OECD? Is it the WTO, where, you know, this resources question is not at all on the agenda? WTO ignores this question today. So we need such a place. We have to raise awareness of public and policy makers on the question of materials. You know, materials, people don't speak about it. When things are going okay, it starts to be on the radar screen when disruptions come. So there is a lot. You will be surprised if you ask to your policy maker when they say we do EVs, but you ask them, yes, where is the materials coming from? What do you mean? And sometimes ago, the OEM were saying, well, you know, we don't care about materials. We have a tier 1 supplier for equipments, go to tier 2 for equipment and so on. And all the materials flow is no problem. So we have a big question of education. We have to make also the best use of the materials, so which is materials efficiency, what we are dealing today. And also, finally, unlocking finance on the global scene, because the infrastructure spendings are going to go from $2 trillion to $5 trillion. And, you know, the private funding will be absolutely necessary. So finally, a word about the EU, the EGD, linked to IRA on one side and linked to Global South on the other side. Big difference for me between the IRA and the European Green Deal. One is, in the EU, we think the price of CO2 is going to make proper behavior change. It's not at all the same in the IRA, as you know. It's direct incentive through tax avoidance or tax allowances, sorry. And it's not at all, IRA don't speak about the CO2 price. It's not the point. You have a big document, $370 billion, clearly no mention of CO2 price. It's a very different approach. The second one is the IRA is focusing on supply chain, securing raw materials, a bit like the EU, I must say. But the EU is focused on innovation, and the IRA is really focusing on what is really done on the ground, be it through innovation or through existing technologies. And frankly, it's very simple for IRA. It's very complex in the EU. If you make green hydrogen in the US, you will get $3 per kilogram in forms of allowance taxes, right? So, and the IRA administration will come and see you and to help you to file for these incentives. So it's a very different approach. And, you have seen the recent Volkswagen announcements and other announcements in the batteries. And really, we have to think on the way we make it as efficient as possible. And finally, the US, it's not about how we are going to deal with imports. It's about local contents in full breach of WTO regulations. So my point is that, we are sometimes in a Jurassic Park here, and we should not be the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park, as you know. So we have really to do on the European Green Deal whatever it takes to be resilient against the IRA. And Global South is also a matter. It's our EGD is very inward focused, and the trade agreements that we have today should be enriched on the material side, as we have already said. But today, if you look at the trade agreements of the EU, they are very important with Canada, Mexico, Chile, Indonesia, Australia, start to be a little bit in Africa. But I think here we have an issue because we have here also to override some historical relations. We have to build trust-based relations. And I think a priority is to build with some friends countries in Africa, real trade agreements with the EU. So these are some thoughts I wanted to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philippe Varin, for your very realistic assessment on the needs from the industry, because the transition, as we know, in electrification in particular, will drive demand for new materials and could potentially fuel conflict throughout the world. So Sebastien Treyer, how can we leverage international governance and maybe the Green Deal to ensure we create a fairer transition? And shall we evolve towards a materials or resource diplomacy?
Thank you very much, Charlotte, and thank you very much to the authors for inviting me to this panel. I think what I liked exactly when you were summing up, Philippe Varin, I like the way we're looking at a report that is both utopian and really based on realpolitik. And I think that's really the beauty of it. I hope everybody's going to be able to look at the details in the report, because a lot of the major generic statements that have been made today are really detailed in proposals that are also very realistic in the way you can implement them on, short term, mid-term, and longer term. That I think is extremely important. I wanted to first, before answering your question, I need to look a little bit domestically at the EU and then come to the international level. And I want to really just emphasize the fact that for the moment, until the domestic debate in the EU kills the farm to fork strategy and the biodiversity strategy, which is currently happening, the European Green Deal was and is the most transformative program envisioned globally, because it's about carbon, it's about biodiversity, and it's about zero pollution. And I think that's really worth stating. I think it was really well decided because it was really taking into account the fact that the EU is very resource dependent. And I want to pay homage to Janez Potocnik being the Environment Commissioner. He was really ahead of times when he was the Commissioner. He insisted so much on the resource dependency of Europe that just after 2019, the Europeans were able to really understand why that was so important. And really, I think this is, you have a lot of the Euro Green Deal necessarily getting to the discussion about sufficiency and not just efficiency, trying to be the continent of less is more, which is not easy. And I will come back to that in a minute, just to say that this sufficiency orientation is geopolitically smart and it's sustainable, but there are some paradoxes in it, domestically and globally. Domestically, I can just say that if we are serious about sufficiency in the way we look at demand side measures, this is completely innovative in terms of the business models that we need to have. Sufficiency oriented business models. It's not just about circular economy, it's about probably the economy of functions. And I think the report is about the economy of as a service rather than using materials. And some of the economic sectors in Europe have already experienced why this would be actually useful for them, because their economic viability is at stake, even without looking at the environmental issues. If you look at the car industry, I mean, I talk in front of Philippe Varin, he might contradict me, but the car industry knows that the market is saturated. You will not sell more cars in Europe. So I believe that many of the car industry is already trying to think about what is the business model of the future when we sell less car and sell more mobility. Not sure that this is an easy answer. I don't have the answer, but this is something important. Food industry, Danone knows that they are not going to sell more yogurts. So what is the business model? I think they're struggling with that. Emmanuel Faber had an answer for probably other reasons also, but one of the reasons why he was taken out of the board was that this addressing directly the issue of sufficiency when you sell less but want to have more profits is for the moment not really acceptable in the boards of the industry, while it's actually something that's absolutely necessary. So I think this issue of how do you look at new ways of value creation in our businesses in Europe is already there because of economic viability issues, but we need to be even more innovative on that. And second point, domestically, of course, if we want to have sufficiency-oriented economies, that at some moment will, and if that entails changes in consumption, that will at some point question the issue of social progress. But I really would insist on saying that it's not just about the fact that we would need to compensate some social groups for the impacts, the social cost of the transition, because actually what is at stake is that our social contract itself is already broken. Even without looking at the ecological transition, we have problems in terms of welfare state. We have our education and health system that are functioning worse than they had been functioning before. Inequalities are growing. Social and political rights are not respected or not owned by those who should own them as citizens. And the promise of intergenerational improvement is not there. So the idea of redefining social progress as it proposed by the Compass is extremely important, because we need to fix the social contract and at the same time, of course, make it without using material abundance as the solution or the aspiration, which was the promise, for instance, of social democrats in this continent for many decades. So this is the paradox inside. And I'm coming to the international question that you've asked me, Charlotte. I'm sorry for having had to do that as a first instance. I think we need to get that right in Europe. And then what the report is telling us is that we even need to get that right at the global level and have Europe be the champion of that. Here at the international level, we have a paradox because we want to have, to some extent, less interdependency because we want to be more sovereign on our resources. And that has been underlined by Francois already. There is the whole issue of reshoring, friendshoring global supply chain. How is that going to be received and perceived by those countries who need industrial jobs in the next decades because of a growing workforce? Yes, we would, for instance, need to import less soybeans for industrial livestock production in Europe. But what does that mean for Brazil and Argentina? They will need to, of course, they know for long, they've been knowing for nearly a century that they need to diversify out of commodity exports, but they haven't found the solution yet. How fast will these economies be able to do this? And how can Europe at the same time reduce their imports of soybeans and accompany those countries in a way that they can diversify their economy? And I think Philippe has been, and other have been talking about the African economies that really will be needing industrialization to offer jobs to a very fast-growing active population. How are we going to build green hydrogen or green steel supply chains where we want the jobs here in Lorraine and Luxembourg, and we want the jobs there for them, for their industrialization. So this seems like a zero-sum game. And I think what the report is putting on the table is extremely important in saying we need to design global value chains that need to be fairer in terms of added value capture, of sharing the industrial jobs and sharing the capacity to innovate. And I think I would need to reflect further on what Philippe was saying about the fact that we here in Europe are looking just at innovation and not directly at existing technologies. But I really bet that if we don't look at the way we embark African economic players as innovators in global supply chains, we are never going to look at those global value chains without looking at them as a zero-sum game, and that's not going to function. My last point is to say the report is really good to be discussed at the OECD, because I believe that this issue of building these decarbonized value chains of the future in a fairer way is, of course, about trade policies, but it's a lot about how do we govern technology and innovation? How do we govern investment in southern countries, which is not exactly just trade policy. It's really about how do we define standards in the finance system? What are the standards of the OECD countries in terms of foreign direct investment, something that might be quite counterintuitive? Can we oblige Western countries to invest in Africa, which they don't do a lot for the moment, and at the same time be very sustainable in the way they share jobs and they ensure that they have no environmental impacts? I think this is the type of thing that needs to be discussed in this forum, OECD, with a foresight view, and also looking at the fact that if Europe, China and the US are competing on state aid to always put more state money on industrialization in our regional economies, then what is left for global south? This is going to be a nightmare for these countries. And this is really why we need also to look at fiscal policies and international fiscal instruments. This is going to be discussed at the June summit in Paris about a new financial green deal between North and South. And I believe we need to try and push, there is a window of opportunity to push these ideas of international fiscal instruments. And the OECD has been really help on those topics for the last years. So this is, I think, the good moment to be both utopian and be in realpolitik. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sebastien Treyer. And that's the perfect segue to invite the authors of the report to comment on this concept of fair transition. And Sandrine, I can see you raising your hand, but going back to the point that Sebastien made on reconciling sovereignty, security, and resilience here in Europe, whilst ensuring that this is not detrimental to the development of other nations in Africa, for instance, Uganda, as Francois mentioned. How do we work together to ensure that everyone feels satisfied at the end of it all?
So we never said that this was going to be easy, right? And I think that's really important, because what we've heard here is the complexity of the challenges that we have before us. And I think there are several things that were not referred to that I'd like to bring in. First of all, thank you to all of the reflectants and all of you who have indicated that actually our report does strike a chord. So we very much appreciate that. Now, the global context is such that actually it fits in perfectly to some of the larger global discussions. For example, the Bridgetown Initiative and the work that Mia Motley is looking at very closely in terms of rethinking trade patterns, debt cancellation, trade deficits, etc. So to come to your question, Charlotte, I think it's really important that we don't actually just look at this report in isolation, nor even the European Green Deal in isolation. Because the fact of the matter is that globally, we are having these discussions. The interdependency is creating difficulties. We know that the inequality between North and South, and thank you, Francois, for bringing up that point again, which is the absolute essence of the work that comes out of Earth for All, a survival guide for humanity, that also myself and Johan Rockström and others have just recently published, which very much addresses the fact that we need new global governance. We need to look at beyond Bretton Woods, even the OECD itself that is doing a fabulous job at looking obviously at new economic models. We know very well that the challenges are such that we have to rethink across the board governance, institutional frameworks in order to reflect exactly what we say in this report. So that's my first point. Let's not think about this report in isolation, nor the European Green Deal in isolation, because we are seeing a series of calls for reform, full stop, to reflect the 3 Cs. I think the other key issue, though, is, and it was not pronounced here, is local production for local consumption, and addressing also the very clear remarks that both myself and Janez made around coming back to demand side management. And yes, Philippe is absolutely right. The tension becomes when our dependencies on certain materials are outside of Europe, but also how do we reframe the European market? For example, now the looking at mines and reopening mines across Europe. Does that mean that actually, in essence, we have to rethink some of our biodiversity directives, which I hope we would not, but at least rethink, and that is what all of the European miners are actually indicating right now, the way in which we produce some of these materials, if we can produce some of these materials. These are some big questions that are out there regarding sovereignty. Or does it mean, as you have asked, Charlotte, what type of trade relations then do we need to put into play, which looks at a co-design of new value chains, which create less harm in the producing country, as well as the company, and also does not continue to export our emissions, which is currently the case, even if, exactly as Francois has indicated, the direct impact of greenhouse gas emissions from Europe has been reduced, and we have been able to decouple. We know full well that a lot of that is because we've exported the problems abroad. And actually, we are exporting and importing high emission products, which is creating an issue. So to come back to what does that actually mean in practice? In practice, what we're trying to say, at least through the report, in our humble opinion, it is incredibly important for Europe to rethink its European Green Deal in terms of the global context. That means that right now, those policies, and thank you for Sebastien coming back to agriculture, for example, the way in which we treat common agricultural policy, the fact that actually our subsidies are creating huge harm in terms of the rest of the globe, in particular in the South, but also that our own industrial agricultural practices and not a shift towards regenerative practices is also creating huge harm. We need to think through both our impacts here and abroad, and we have not shifted now in the way in which we should have already with the European Green Deal to a proper farm to fork policy, because we continue to enable CAP reform to do exactly what we're not saying to do, actually, in the farm to fork policy. We need to ensure that we move swiftly towards a phase out of fossil energy. Clearly, at the last COP, Europe gave a very strong, ambitious push in this direction. But that means that we need to figure out what types of relations then do we have to have with our fossil fuel producers and those that we are dependent on. And I very much appreciate Philippe's comments there around the taxonomy. Let us not be hypocritical in terms of the way in which we promote the shift towards green projects at the European level and continue to promote the use of gas when actually, and enable the gas to be labeled as green, when actually gas should not be labeled as green. So not a lot of necessarily clear answers, Charlotte, to your questions, apart from the fact that I think we do need to remember that this report has come out at a time which actually builds on a global context, which is really unpacking the current issues that we have in the institutional frameworks that exist, the current overdependency on supply, the current overdependency on institutional frameworks that don't actually enable the South to develop economically in a way which has less emissions, and the responsibility of Europe to be ambitious in not only reducing its own emissions, but also in partnering with other countries across the globe to reduce their emissions.
Yes, I can see Heather, please, and Janez.
Thanks very much. I just wanted to point to a couple of revolutionary ideas in the report that are expressed quite diplomatically. So you may not entirely appreciate on first reading how revolutionary they are, but they're really vital. So there is, of course, the concept of sufficiency, the idea of how much exactly do we need in order to meet human needs, rather than how much can we buy at the lowest price. But one of the ideas for achieving sufficiency is a very interesting one in economics, which is moving from ownership to use as the primary means of organizing the economy. So this is beyond the idea of a circular economy, as Janez was pointing out earlier, a circular economy which is primarily about reuse and recycling, because as Philippe pointed out earlier, we don't yet have enough of the technologies, for example, batteries, actually in Europe, in the European economy, to rely on reuse and recycling, remanufacture, for example, as the primary means of ensuring circularity. There will be a lot of mining before that. And of course, reuse and particularly recycling take up a lot of energy and often have pollution involved if it's chemical recycling, for example. So recycling is great, but it is the last resort, really. Whereas if you think about sufficiency, a much better model is to start with eco-design. And how do you incentivize manufacturers to do eco-design? Well, by making a success, i.e. in terms of profits, in terms of a new kind of business model, as Sebastien was referring to, based on how much customers use those their products and use their services, rather than how many units they buy. And a fantastic example that Janez has particularly elaborated is the humble refrigerator. You know, if you buy a refrigerator and it belongs to you personally, and if it goes wrong, it's your responsibility to fix it. And then when it goes really wrong and can't be fixed, especially if it hasn't been designed to be fixed, then you take it to the waste dump where somebody else takes care of the waste problem, and you buy another one. If you move instead to buying cooling services, where a company supplies a refrigerator to your house and then comes and fixes it if it doesn't work, and that company is responsible for making sure it's energy efficient, that it doesn't contain CFCs and other toxic materials for the environment, and that company then comes and takes it away when a new, better, upgraded model is available. Then you, the consumer, you get a better service and you don't have to deal with a lot of the externalities, but also the company has a fundamental incentive to design a quite different kind of refrigerator. Okay, so as we move to mobility services, so for example, the OECD report for Ireland, shows how much it's about mobility services, not about selling more cars. That can apply in so many other domains, also in solar panels, also in refrigerators and so on. So I just want to introduce that kind of concept to you, because fundamentally our economic policy objectives are based on 20th century models of production and consumption, many of which are no longer relevant, even for wealthy consumers in Europe and the United States, let alone for consumers in lower income countries. And if we start thinking about sufficiency in demand side management as being about meeting human needs, and that's not even just the basic needs, that can also be the need for having cooled food and drink, then you can start thinking about the objectives of economic policy in a completely different way. You can stop thinking about it as being absolute jobs and growth, particularly jobs in old industries, but thinking about meeting needs in ways that leads to innovation in service provision, and that itself drives the eco-design. So if we want to incentivize a different kind of sufficiency-based economy, then we need to change the prices, change the metrics, but also change some of the economic concepts. Finance ministries are still quite 20th century in their thinking, so it's time to upgrade the mindset.
Thank you very much, Heather. And before we hear from Janez, I just wanted to hear the view of Philippe Varin here, since you mentioned mobility and this concept of sufficiency. We know that in the car sector, there's a shift going on away from ownership towards shared use. So how are you reinventing business models? How are you adapting to this change? And is it necessarily anti-growth?
I would not say it's anti-growth. I think indeed that if you look at this situation of EVs, you know, what we are currently doing in Europe is to say, well, we have to catch up with China because they've taken, you know, big advantage. We are going to open mines everywhere, including in Europe. I think it's fine. To a certain extent, because first, as Janez has said, we have really to think of our business model. Having robotaxis in the cities where you have a utilization rate of 50% instead of the 5% rate of utilization of your individual cars, it's a 10 times less use of materials. So, and obviously the car makers today, as you can see, they are all going through, you know, car sharing and, you know, they are building new businesses here. And I think we should promote this definitely. But also, we have also to go beyond this thinking. Today, we are promoting the lithium-ion technology as being the technology on batteries, which is obviously the most efficient. But if you want to make 700 kilometers with a car, you will have to use lithium-ion batteries. But a big share of the use of these cars is for city cars or, you know, peripheral cars. You need only, say, 200, 300 of autonomy kilometers, and you can recharge very much more often. So you don't need always lithium-ion. You can use, say, sodium-ion, and sodium, you can find it everywhere in the water. So I'm sure that with car sharing business models, with using at the same time alternative chemistries for the batteries, if you rethink the system, using all, you know, the technologies they can use, I think we can have some very interesting solutions, just as an example.
Thank you very much. And over to Janez now.
Yeah, it's piling, you know. If I start at the end with the anti-growth, there are some fundamental questions, what the growth is and how you measure it. Because if you measure it only in GDP, you are basically having, if we use the compass word, the wrong compass, which is leading you in the direction of extreme resource-intensive use. And when we talk about servitizations, services are growth. They are part of GDP. You measure them inside. It is actually anti-material and energy growth, which is, totally different story than anti-growth story. And that's basically the basics of decoupling if you want to achieve it. Otherwise, keep on dreaming. Because these are essential things which we need to, where we need to clearly define what is right and what is wrong. So when Heather was talking about example of refrigerator, what is actually difference? In the first case, if you are owing the refrigerator, number of refrigerators are the base of producers' profit. In the second case, they are producers' costs. You drive them to save resources, and they have to decide. And it's not the whole philosophy. It's basically based on that. We don't need cars. We need mobility. You don't need chair. You need to sit. You don't need light bulbs here. You need the light. So that's the whole approach and the logic which we are trying to basically follow. And by the way, the next International Resource Panel report will be exactly 100% based on that. We will not talk about maximizing the number of products on the markets measured through the GDP, but meeting human needs in the most resource efficient way. And that's all. And that is not anti-growth concept, it's survival concept. Because if we don't go that way, we will have other things to talk which will stop our growth. Growth, economic one. So that's the first point. The second point I would like to tell you in that context how to protect and how we would survive the European Green Deal, because it's a serious question now. And Philippe, I would start with basically your sentence: access to resource will create political risks. Actually, in the whole human history, access to resources, be it water, land, oil, or whatever, was creating political risks. Only that in the period of the limits of growth, nobody really talked about that. But now when we have growth of limits, which is actually after 50 years after the limits of growth, we are forced to think about those things. So they are again creating risks in various kind of ways you look at it. But my point was, if you look to the World Economic Forum, and I have again mentioned World Economic Forum, you know whom represents. If you look to their table of risks in 2 years and risks in 10 years, you will find out that risks in 2 years are a mixed bag. Risk in 10 years are all green. Among 6 of them, 5 are environmental related. So do we really want that we will soon have 2 years risks all green and then we will start talking seriously? Or would be more intelligent that we start somehow aligning our 2 years policies with the 10 years policies? Because that's basically what we are deciding at this moment. So we have to understand that we call it environmental transition. Actually, it's transition to sustainable society and future. That transition is the story of peace and war, of stability, security, and equality. And if we put it in that way in European Green Deal, then it would be understood, because this is the challenge which we in Europe currently are seeing and facing and are ready to answer, while we are not ready to follow entirely from the pure environmental things. Why the hell was my circular economy package immediately removed when next commission step in place? Because it is always seen, if environment commissioner puts something on the table, it's anti-economic. No, it's not anti-economic. It's anti-closed, open mind people. So you have to see and understand it in the right concepts and prospects. That's the right way to look at it. And the last point which I want to do, how to keep Global South on board, because that was the question which we asked many times. You know, I can prove with IRP data, basically, because we have material productivity, it's one of the lines, and material productivity is efficiency of material use per unit of GDP. It is on a global level, it was growing till year 2000 and then started to drop. How is that possible if it's growing in all the countries? Because we have shifted a lot of our dirty production around the year 2000 from global north to global south, 25, 30 years ago. So now things are produced in less resource efficient countries, which you are buying. Before they were produced more in resource efficient countries like Europe, like Japan. So that's the shift which happened, which fine, it happened. But if we then in climate talks go there and ask everybody, now clean your production, and we don't ask the question who the hell is consuming those products, Do you think that we will get Global South on board? The only answer which they have in their hands is requesting more loss and damage. And they are doing that because they don't see the other way. They don't see the answers where we would look into the mirror. And as long as we will be doing that, there will be more loss and damage. There will be more of those questions. But my dear friends, loss and damage, it's not limiting warming for 0, 0, 0, 0, nothing. So we have to talk about drivers and pressures which are leading us there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Janez. I knew I'd make you react with my G-word question. We're running out of time, and I promised our audience today that you would be able to ask questions to our panelists. But before I do, I think it's only fair that I should ask Sebastien Treyer and Francois Gemenne maybe to offer their final thoughts. François gone, sorry. Oh. Okay.
I prefer that we go to the audience.
Okay. Any questions from the audience? We've got one there.
Thank you. This has been a really interesting presentation. I wanted to ask about, so there was a comment about net zero poverty alongside with net zero emissions. We have a timeline for net zero emissions. 120 countries committing, 2060 at latest, but 2050 for most of the OECD countries. So what's the timeline on the other side of this? Because I think there's an implicit assumption that I think is in agreement with the report that global inequality to meet the current agreements and goals on net zero emissions have implicit assumptions about unequal standards of living. And I think I would push beyond just poverty. So what is the timeline for equal standards of living across different across the whole world?
Shah, do you want me to go ahead and answer that one? First of all, thank you for a fantastic question. And you're right, we don't have a timeline. And that's why I was bringing in some of the Bridgetown discussions. And that's also why Rihanna's brought up the tensions, because that is the innate tension, right? And that's why some have actually created and talked about carbon apartheid, because it's not addressing the poverty issue. If you look at the system dynamic modeling that we undertook in Earth for All, a survival guide for humanity, we came up with the well-being index. And the well-being index shows very clearly that if we don't fundamentally decrease poverty levels and inequality, the timeline is that we actually have to ensure that all countries meet an income level of $15,000 per person in order to truly rebalance the inequality. That timeline is 2050. So in our two scenarios, the giant leap scenario, which actually enables us to truly meet our environmental and climate targets, because by the way, we also say that conversely, if we don't deal with poverty and inequality, we will not meet our climate objectives, exactly for the reasons that Janez has brought up, because we continuously just throw it out on the South, both in terms of the products that we are consuming and the emissions that are increasing, but also the fact that we are actually having the greatest impact on the most vulnerable countries. And we're not assuming that responsibility. So I hope that answers your question. 2050, absolutely. Now, maybe last point, we are actually working with patriotic billionaires, Oxfam and others, many who are starting to say very similar things. I mean, the patriotic billionaires are actually saying that in the United States, we must reduce the inequality gap, even within the US, with again, very stringent income requirements and minimum wage requirements.
Thank you very much, Sandrine. One more question from the audience over there, please.
Thank you, Claire Mellier. I'm one of the co-founders of the Global Citizens Assembly that took place in the lead up to COP26. And I'm hearing a lot of comments about governance. I'd love to hear your take on where citizens fit in this and how our model of governance need to change to really allow the voices of citizens to be brought into the discourse.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. It's a very relevant question. You might recall that there have been a number of attempts to think about global governance with global democracy. Jürgen Habermas, the German philosopher, came up with an idea in 2015 that there should be a UN parliament based on the European Parliament, which I think kind of showed that he didn't know the European Parliament really very well at all. And the tricky thing is that our models of democracy, as they've evolved since the 19th century, are very much based on two conditions that don't apply when it comes to the climate crisis. The first is that the idea that a constituency gives a political mandate to a government based on the constituents in a particular country. So it's territorially bound, and therefore can't take into account the differences that will happen, what happens in other countries. The point made earlier about the damage that happens in a country because of what happens elsewhere in the world. And the other condition that doesn't apply is the idea that it's today's constituents voting now who give a mandate to the government, and the government serves only those constituents. So it's also time bound in a way that doesn't reflect on the impact of our actions for future generations having a habitable planet to live on. So I think these are the fundamental challenges for democracy, where there needs to be obviously a lot more connection between citizens across countries, but also citizens between generations, giving a voice to those who have not yet been born, those who will come in the future, as well as giving voice to those who are affected by what happens in one country, particularly if it's a wealthy, very high consuming country for the other countries. And I don't think we've got to a new model for this. Loss and damage is backwards looking, and we need actually a forwards looking model as well. We need to be able to connect the polluter pays principle, so important, that Jo referred to earlier. It was absolutely fundamental to get that in place. But now it's very hard to identify who is the polluter, who put a particular, greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and when. This now is quite hard to track. So what we really need, I think, in terms of the democratic side of all of this, is a new concept of climate justice, which doesn't pit the citizens of one country against the citizens of another country, or the citizens of today against the citizens of tomorrow. And that's where I think we need a new concept of citizenship in order to upgrade the idea of having a habitable planet that meets the human needs of all of its more billions of inhabitants in the future. We're still very far from being able to think in those terms.
Thank you very much, Heather. Unfortunately, we do not have time for further questions, but I'd like to hear from Jo Tyndall, who's going to offer closing remarks.
Thank you very much. I'm quite happily sit here for the rest of the day and continue this conversation, because it's been absolutely riveting and some hugely important questions and comments made. The IPCC report is really ambitious, but very, very important. And I think it's incredibly useful to have this compass kind of representation as an at a glance, if you like, set of directions. Just a few quick comments. Clearly, Europe is not an island. And there is a very strong need for collaboration with the rest of the world. The last thing we want is to be shifting the deck chairs on the Titanic in trying to deal with climate change. And that's come through that really we're just sort of saying we've got our solution, but we're pushing the problem out somewhere else. We're trying to do this, though, this international collaboration and cooperation at the very time when the era of globalization is beyond being under threat. People have decided it's basically come to an end. So questions like onshoring, the issues of populism and so on are really creating big challenges to being able to create the framework for collaboration and cooperation that we sadly need. I thought it was a really important point that people act in self-interest. Governments act in self-interest as well, in the sense that they want to get re-elected. So if you look, for example, at parts of the global south where there's a growing middle class, the attitude at the moment is to follow the global north and to follow a kind of consumerist approach. So we really do have to be thinking very much about the sort of things the IPCC report is talking about, getting the right actions, sending the right signals, pricing or otherwise, and we have to kind of promote that to promote a rethink and behavior change. I thought it was a really important point to see humans as part of nature, not external or superior to nature. And that is seriously fundamental to putting people and planet first, alongside or even ahead of profits, and really interesting ideas about how to shift the approach to economic prosperity and growth. There are so many multiple moving parts to this. It's as you said, it's not a simple solution. So many things, many balls needed to be juggled at the same time to get it going. But I want to finish on a positive note, or semi-positive. Disruptions really do focus the mind. While there might be some negative impacts, a kind of risk of beggar thy neighbor policies in response to what's happening at the moment with the perma crisis, for example, there are also positive ones around innovation, around diversification, around commercialization and thinking in different ways. I think the world is starting to get ready for that rethink about resource use and so on, materials use. And I just wanted to say that while it might sometimes take time, things and attitudes do change. If any of you watched the series Mad Men quite a few years ago now, there's a scene that's etched in my mind, and it was of the family going out for a picnic. They go out for a picnic and everything is disposable plastic because the world was built for convenience and throw away. And they get up from their picnic and they just walk away and leave this complete mess of plastic behind lying on the ground. Well, that attitude, I mean, let's not pretend that it's gone away completely, but things change. People do have different attitudes over time and it's possible to change them. So I hope that the IPCC report, that the compass can really help to reframe and rethink. I want to thank everyone here, the Systemiq team for pulling this together, the panelists, to Charlotte as moderator, and to a very attentive and engaged audience. I'll stop there because I know we're over time, but thank you all very much indeed for coming to the OECD today.